Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements. And today we're talking about Nico Villareal's review of Flowers for Marx, the collection of essays by Ben Burgess, Comrade Hamilton, Mac McManus, and Ernesto Vargas that was forwarded by Daniel Tutt, and which we've had a symposium of 2 episodes. Now, I'm going to have a lot of these people back on the show. I'm particularly interested in talking more to Ernesto about the Mexican situation, and I'll be in touch with him to do that. I'd also love to have a more formal debate between Ben and Conrad, but apparently they do that all the time. Now, for my part, I found the book interesting. I mean, I should divulge, I also have a contract with Revol Press on a book on politics that I'm writing with R.L.E.L.L.E. Smith. And I may be working with Daniel to turn the notes that Shalon and I made for our last book into a series of essays with a few other people. That's yet to happen. The last book got exhausted by years of research and my tendency to expand and expand and expand what I want to prove. And thus a 150-page book, when I planned it out, would be like 2 volumes of 500 pages, and just no one wants to read that, nor could I get it published. So we'll see what we do with that. But I'm going to just make it clear I have relations to all involved. I like Donald Parkinson over there at Cosmonaut and the Cosmonaut editors. I work regularly with Nico Villareal. Ben Burgess is a personal friend. I know Comrade Hamilton from back when I worked at Zero. The only person I actually don't really know that well is Ernesto. And like I said, I want to have him on the show to talk about his history. Now, all that rambling preamble aside, let's get into this review and talk about it, because I'm kind of using this as a launching point to continue discussion about the issues of this book, even more than the controversies around its publication, which, while interesting about debates about censorship, highly relevant today. I'm recording this after the debacles around Jeremy Campbell and Stephen Colbert, and also, and in my sense, more importantly, the use of political intimidation to silence all kinds of normal people, where political speech is probably even more important and less backed up by money. But nonetheless, here we are. Should we be this censorious? Is deplatforming or refusing to publish censorship, etc., etc.? I find all those questions interesting, but not as interesting as the debates of the book itself. And so let's get into what Nico has to say. You can find this over at Cosmonaut, and as always, I will include the link in the show notes. I like Cosmonaut's new design, by the way. It's way clearer. When Science is Abandoned, the Flowers Wither, a review of Flowers for Marx. Now, I will admit that Nico is very interested in Marxism as a scientific project, as is Cosmonaut in general. I will also say that Nico's view of science is largely structural and structuralist. Although he has critiques of classical structuralism, he is highly influenced by Althusser, and particularly the late Althusser, on these issues. And you should have that in mind as we read this. Flowers from Marx, a new collection of essays on Marxism, successfully facilitates a dialogue between multiple camps of contemporary socialist movements, but it suffers from its contributors' collective reluctance to defend Marxism as a heterodox science. Now, I even think the idea of heterodox science is silly. There's just science or not science. But we can get into that because heterodox and science are all contested terms, argues Nicolas Villareal, or Nico. Is Marxism a science? Question mark. Flowers for Marx provides an excellent window into this live debate as it exists on the contemporary left through a series of essays that can roughly be split into 2 camps. Democratic socialism, as exemplified by frequent Jacobin commentators Matthew McManus and Ben Burgess, and a position somewhere between Marxist-Leninism and Third Worldism found in the authors Conrad Hamilton and Ernesto Vargas. I would say they are probably Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, which is not quite third worldism, but would be the in-between between socialism, Marxist-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, which is classical Maoism, and Marxist internationalist Maoism or Marxist-Leninism, third worldism, which are the 80s third worldist movements. I don't know that Conrad and Ernesto would explicitly say they have those ideologies, and I'm not even sure they're totally consistent on them. But from my interview, that's kind of the space that they seem to rhyme with. And for those of you who don't know your various forms of Maoism, I talk about it a lot, but there's a lot of them. And while people make fun of Trotskyism for having all kinds of sectarian splits, divergence, and whatnot, it is also true of Marxist-Leninism, particularly in its Maoist variants. All right. For sure, the two sides differ on just about everything, well, except on markets where they actually agree. I don't know what Ernesto thinks about that, but I do know what Conrad does. From the question of continuity versus rupture between the bourgeois society and any future socialism to the historical legacy of actually existing communism to the theoretical methods. Yet, strangely enough, the authors do have one thing in common. Neither side seems to want to wholeheartedly defend the position that Marxism is, or at least should be, a science. Well, what kind of science? I would ask. Okay. This is somewhat frustrating, as all the major authors they cite on this question, whether it be Marx himself, Althusser, G.A. Cohen, at least in his early period, would have argued forcefully that the project is called scientific socialism. Yeah, the analytic Marxists, the Althusserians, and Marx himself all insisted on scientific socialism, as he even did the Hegelian, quote, Western Marxist, which is probably what, when you refer to Western Marxism, you refer to is the Hegelianism of people relying on the phenomenology of spirit for their discussion about Marxism. But, you know, that category has been expanded to shit, from Alvin Goldner to Domenico Lacerto to Russell Jacobi to Harry Anderson, and even Kevin Anderson's kind of rejection of Harry Anderson. You keep on seeing more and more different types of socialism casted as Western Marxism. So we should probably just call it Hegelian Marxism. Even that's a little bit confusing, because many of the Soviet and Eastern Marxists were Hegelians. They're just Hegelians who focus on the science of logic. Blah! There's a lot of context there, but there you go. A project that, although there probably would have been considerable disagreement among the above-mentioned figures regarding its content, depends on an actual scientific project, particularly in the form of historical materialism. After all, how is dialectical materialism possible without historical materialism undergirding it? Or, to put it more clearly, how can we change the world if we don't understand it? How exactly did this happen that in the past 50 years or so, the claim became so indefensible? I don't have a precise answer, though I suspect it has something to do with the actual tradition of Marxist scientific praxis being broken, and also probably scandals like Lysenko and a bunch of other things. The denial of the Big Bang, even though Marxists actually contributed a ton to genetic theory. I mean, Haldane was a Marxist-Leninist. It's not just Stephen Jay Gould people. It is still, there is still a tension around that in Darwinianism. Regardless of his exact cause, this omission in the essay within Flowers for Marx is quite glaring and only possible through key misreadings and inaccuracies. Well, what are they? Althusser is philosopher of what? After a fascinating introduction by Daniel Tutt on the role that the opposition to censorship played in thought of the early Marx, I mean, you can see this in Hal Draper's first volume of Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, or in anything Marx wrote on the topic, most of his letters, anything in the 1844 and 1848 manuscripts. I mean, I can go on and on about Marx's opposition to censorship. Although he always put the caveat in, is that the bourgeois world would only limit that censorship to the state and let censorship by civil society go rampant, which is also true, and a contradiction that really affects us now, as those borderlines aren't clear anymore. But were they ever clear before the appearance of bourgeois society? I don't know. Both McManus and Hamilton rely extensively on Althusser in their exchange. McManus uses him as a foil to attempt to show why a normative vocabulary is so important to Marxism. which I think is true, but also not the main point. Whereas Hamilton shows how painting Althusser as against normativity simply because he was against Marxist humanism for strategic reasons is something of a straw man. I mean, do go on. However, it is worth considering McManus's claim as they are, as it's common enough argument. He states, why should we care that the historical destiny of humankind is to become freer and more mentally well off rather than simply be wiped out like most of the species in the planet's far longer history? Why be partisan for mankind? This is why the descriptive vocabulary of Marxism must be tied to one which is normative as well. If one thinks for a moment, this actually doesn't follow at all. I mean, actually, yes, it does, Nico. This is, but I'll let you try to philosophically argue this. Why does the question of whether or not we care about mankind have anything to do with what Marxism says, let alone what its vocabulary is? Because its vocabulary implies norms. All vocabulary implies norms. Althusser would tell you that a vocabulary implies norms through its interpolation. Come on, Nico. It is easy enough to establish that normativity matters, or indeed that it matters to a political project, but what precisely is the connection to the content of Marxism? Okay. Well, because there is an implication in Marx's use of language that is not always moral. His use of metaphors are not scientific. I do think he has a scientific project, and I think a scientific project can be separated from the normative one and is way more important, which is why he just kind of throws the normative out. But you still can't use it to derive an is from an ought or an ought from an is. People come to Marxist politics out of all sorts of diverse motivations. Yeah, mine wasn't actually normative. Mine was actually about economic truth. Although I have normative concerns that overlap with Marxism, that's not why I ended up here. There's many things that deal with those normative concerns. Should the point be simply to iron out the differences so that all they care about are the exact same things? Have the exact same normative project? No, they should not have the exact same normative project. That's why factions and tendencies should exist. I think, Nico, we are in agreement about that. Certainly, sometimes it feels like that's the point of radical politics when it veers into all the ills Daniel Tutt describes in his introduction, a culture of censorship that has pervaded radical publishing, which this book itself was a victim of. This isn't mean to be a glib jab at McManus, whose politics do not share this censoriousness, but it is worth remembering that at the time Althusser was writing, Marxist humanism, which McManus champions, was specifically the state ideology of the post-Stalin USSR and the official communist parties, particularly in the West. I mean, they kind of were everywhere, but it was much more obvious in the Communist Party of France and Communist Party of Italy. And you even see this today because there's an attempt to kind of say parts of this Marxist humanism in people like Domenico Lacerdo, Gabriel Rockhill, even if it's a Marxist-Leninist version of it, and they would reject Khrushchev utterly, that humanism's still there. Let us recall that this language of freer and more well-off as a historical destiny was just as well used by those who undid the Prague Spring with authoritarian violence, invaded Hungary, and from whom the nickname Tanky was invented. I mean, it really was invented about that and should probably be limited to those things. This was actually existing Marxist humanism. I mean, basically, there was Marxist humanism on both sides of that debate. Structuralism really wasn't involved, and Nico is right here. If McManus's point is to show that he takes his humanist premise more seriously than his predecessors, then all power to him. However, it would seem that in order to put this in a more serious version of Marxist humanism into practice, one would need more than a vocabulary, I agree, which certainly Khrushchev and even Stalin did not lack. No, they both appealed to bourgeois values. Sorry, peeps. One needs a theory of history and society, and not merely a descriptive one, but a causal one which allows one to discern the potential differences and consequences of strategic strategies. And here gets to why I think a lot of people abandon Marxism as a science, because a causal theory also implies a predictive theory, at least a probable predictive theory. So a prediction of what is most likely to happen. And there is one implied in Marx. It's not just socialism is inevitable, although he does sometimes say that. It is socialism and Evo are the common ruin of mankind. Now, some people might go, well, socialism has kept on evolving, and prior predictions of all sorts of Marxists, from Heinrich Grossman to Marx himself, to Rosa Luxemburg, to Lenin's early enthusiasm about the German revolutions, etc., did not happen. And this makes the causal science a little bit of a problem for people. I think Nico probably knows this. In fact, I know he does. One needs a theory of history and society, and not merely a descriptive one, but a causal one which allows one to discern potential different consequences from different strategies, which is absolutely true. But this is absolutely the problem that a lot of people are embarrassed by Marxism as a science. This isn't to say that one cannot find traces of such a theory in the pages of Jacobin or even the writings of McManus himself. I mean, he's basically, McManus has a sort of Whiggish liberalism about him, but not one that is inevitable or automatic. To show that the central claim of this normativity argument just doesn't hold up. Well, the central claim that there's a normativity implied in Marxist values is true. The claim that it should dominate the content of Marxism as a theoretical exercise, that does not follow, and I would agree with you, Nico, on that, despite what I said earlier. However, getting people to care about that normative project probably does, the scientific project is normatively valent, because the purpose to change the world being based on the scientific project does have normative implications, and one cannot collapse them, even though German idealism has tried to. But again, if you're a structuralist, you've rejected German idealism and its influence on Marxism, and thus you can't hold that up. Don't know what to tell you, man. So I agree with you, and yet I also think you're underplaying some of the points of this basic proposition that a lot of people like McManus offer. Like, you're using the content of Marxism in a way that covers way more than just its scientific project. It's supposed to be based on a scientific project, but it's not just that. Otherwise, no political project would necessarily flow from it, because the political project implies the imposition of norms. So logically, yes, McManus is oversimple, but then the content of Marxism is also being oversimplified as only its scientific project alone by Nico. Is Marxism a science? Is any ism anything? Marxists should engage in science, and our science should be the basis of and reflection of historical materialism. I completely agree with you, but that is not all Marxism is, even in Marx. Scientific socialism is not historical materialism, because scientific socialism implies socialist norms. Now, the vocabulary stuff, that's discourse crap, and we can throw that out. I mean, the vocabulary implies stuff, and I think you use that in rhetorical analysis to figure out what Marx cared about normatively, but like, that's not our problem. Isn't a techne of rhetoric, right? And I think I'd agree with Nico on that as well. Let's go back to Villareal's point. It is simply not followed that because normativity is important to Marxism requires a normative vocabulary, or that Marxist humanism and the other ideologies have an exclusive claim on such a vocabulary. That is completely true. So if the content of Marxism is fixed by its normative vocabulary, then why should there only be one claim if we're engaged in historical materialism, which has implications for both the scientific and non-scientific elements of Marxism? All right. Unless perhaps you were about to think about the primary strategic considerations was how to win a debate about normative preferences, which is a plausible line of thought for Jacobin milieu, whose practical sensuous reality is consumed by such debates. I mean, it's consumed by debates, period. In contrast to McManus, Hamilton takes Althusser somewhat seriously as a philosopher of science, but not without making certain key misreadings or errors himself. For example, Hamilton claims that Althusser excluded the whole empirical element of science from his theory until 1966 due to the scolding he received from the French Communist Party for the theoreticist and sectarian deviations. This simply isn't true. In reading Capital, Althusser only insists that the categories of a theory or a structure relate to each other as abstractions. Such a theory of relationship between economies and politics don't explain empirical data of politics through an abstract theory of economics, but that the empirical economics may relate to the empirical politics, which can be described by abstract theory of relationship between economics and politics. Yes, the abstract is not the sensuous, although the sensuous is affected by the abstract and should feed back in on it. In this case, the empirical relates to a science specifically through the relationship of empirical to abstract to its abstract category, which is nothing more, nothing less than a basic structuralist insight that before we can establish a relationship between certain phenomena, we must break up the continuum of experience of the phenomenon into signs and figure out how we're talking about them and how that affects how we understand them. I mean, decoding and encoding signs is important because it makes communicating scientific truth possible, or communicating anything possible. I think that's actually an important part of what Nico is getting at here. And despite my frustration about his overclaim about content, I think this is fundamentally true. Probably a more relevant error when it comes to the question of Marxism as a science is Hamilton and McManus's agreement that Althusser was attempting to create an alternative criteria for scientificity vis-a-vis Karl Popper's notion of falsifiability. I mean, John J. Mouthwad Paul, I can't say his name. The Canadian Maoist philosopher actually tries to use falsifiability. But I don't think Althusser does that. And I also think falsifiability is a good criterion for science because probability almost completely destroys it. Anyone who's ever studied the demarcation line problems will tell you that Popper's strict falsifiability claims don't really hold up in light of math. Anyway. But Althusser does not do this. In his book, Philosophy for Non-Philosophers, Althusser states outright that the British philosopher Popper was right to insist on the risk of experimental refutation, if he worked up to an idealist philosophy of the conditions to which a theory may subscribe. Even if he worked up to an idealist philosophy of the conditions to which the theory may subscribe in advance, if it is to be certain squarely confronting this risk. Emphasis mine. So empirical refutation is actually very important to science, but falsifiability can never be truly discerned by empirical refutation, and Popper ignores this. In a way, Althusser doesn't. Aha! You know, I'm not an Althusserian like Nico here, but I actually think this is a key point. Considering the clear statement on Popper, what exactly was Althusser getting at? Althusser begins reading Capital with reflection on Marx's extraordinary discoveries in Capital, specifically that Marx discovered something within classical political economy as an answer to the question which was never asked, which is to say, he had discovered a conceptual oversight through immanent critique, a kind of logical deductive science. It's worth quoting Althusser at length here. Quote, "We have reached our real problem, the problem that exists in and is posed by the actual identity of this organic confusion of non-vision and vision. Or, rather, this observation of non-vision, our oversight, we are no longer dealing with the reading of classical economics through the grid of Marxist theory alone, with a comparison between classical theory and Marxist theory, the latter providing the standard. We can never compare classical theory with anything except itself, its non-vision with its vision. We are therefore dealing, aka that's a very elaborate way of saying we're doing immanent critique. We are therefore dealing with our problem in its pure state, defined in a single domain without any regression to infinity. To understand this necessity and paradoxical identity of non-vision and vision within vision itself is exactly to pose our problem, the problem of necessary connection that unites the visible and the invisible, and to pose it properly is to give ourselves a chance of solving it. Therefore, is this identity of non-vision and vision and the vision possible? Let us reread our text carefully. In the course of the questions, classical economics asks about the value of labor. Something very special has happened. Classical political economy has produced, just as Engels will say in the preface to Volume 2, the philologic chemistry produced oxygen and classical economics produced surplus value. A correct answer, that the value of labor is equal to the value of subsistence goods necessary for the reproduction of labor. A correct answer is a correct answer. Any reader in which the first manner will give Smith and Ricardo a good mark and pass on to other observations, but not Marx, for which we shall call his eye has been attracted by a remarkable property of this answer. It is a correct answer to a question that just one failing, it is never posed. What Althusser is referring to here, of course, was the strange omission of classical political economy, whose orthodoxy had found that labor is the source of all value, which Marx doesn't think it. Well, Marx doesn't think labor is the source of all wealth. Marx does think labor is social value, and those are not the same thing. And then question what determined value and found the cost of reproducing that labor in a subsistence good. The discrepancy then between the cost of subsistence good and the full value of the goods produced by laborers that are reproduced was treated either as a residual or the result of some deeper metaphysical relation between value and the capitalist. In other words, bourgeois political economists have posed one question: what determines the value of commodities? But answers it with an answer of an entirely different question: what determines the value of labor as a commodity, i.e., wages? What's important here is not the particulars of this history, which is probably well trodden by now. I mean, all over the place. But the sort of operation Althusser is doing, and which he draws out in his work. Classical political economy didn't make an incorrect claim. They were nonetheless excluding certain facts because they were, for various reasons, not motivated to see them. Ideology may not always be deceit as in a lie. It's usually not deceit as in a lie, actually. But it does tend to make us ignore things that are inconvenient to us. I mean, so does cognitive dissonance, of which ideology plays, but, it still works for here. On a level of class society, this entails whole sciences that are motivated to ignore certain facts. Althusser does not merely claim that many sciences don't meet the level of falsifiability. He states explicitly that Marx applied the very same requirement on his sciences as those which were imposed on other sciences that had achieved autonomy as a field and merely applied these requirements to a new domain. I'm still not going to accept that falsifiability is actually a criterion for science, and I do think Nico needs to read more of the non-Marxist scientific debates before claiming that, because probability is a real problem for it. But experimental falsification is how most, but not all, sciences work. Popper's answer doesn't really get you out of the problem here. Popper's answer is a way out of positivism. But anyway, this domain was not accessible to bourgeois scientists, and to this day they refuse it. Some have compared Althusser's theory of science to Thomas Kuhn's, and indeed there are some similarities. But what truly differentiates Althusser as a philosopher of science from all the others is that he is concerned with a particular type of science. He provides a philosophy for a heterodox science, which is a science which is suppressed and dissonant, or the science of which is unseen. I think the category of heterodox science is kind of still a problem, but we can neither go around here. I do think the science of what is unexplored in your assumptions is kind of what Althusser is getting into. If you want to call that heterodox science, go ahead. For the more general philosophy of science, the process for a scientific field or a theory to go from dissonant to mainstream and orthodox is a simple one. Despite all the bitterness, acrimony, and even persecution of dissonant scientists, eventually the insurmountable evidence is accepted by the broader scientific community due to their common possession of reason or something of that effect. Well, unless there's an ideological barrier to it. It doesn't always win, Nico. That's actually Whiggish. Althusser, whose theory of ideology identifies universalities as a tool of state ideology production, believes that the divisions of class society produce ideologically blind spots that are more enduring and systemically necessary. By the same token, however, Althusser does not simply affirm any set of ideas which are supposed by the ruling class ideological system, but sets out very carefully as a criteria for appraising these suppressed ideas, to which we might rise to a level of science or not. The problem is especially acute because in the establishment of new science, which is the case for Marxism, historical materialism, one cannot rely on the existing standard for scientificity as they are stated, but must figure out how to translate those standards into a new domain. AKA, how do you do experiments on stuff that you don't have good categories for because the bourgeois scientists haven't established them and are deliberately not looking at the things that would produce them? And the answer is generally imminent critique, but still. There are two essential criteria for Althusser sets out for the appraisal of the dissident scientists. One is that it should have a connection to a material object, which establishes as a material fact a new dimension of knowledge. For ancient Greeks, this was the geometrical compass. For Galileo, it was a telescope. For Lavoisier, it was oxygen. For Marx, it was a proletariat and surplus value. One of the things to not like the other. Of two sides of the same coin. That's true. The first criteria is established from the standpoint of philosophic materialism. The second criteria is that the individual judgment of the militant who, when faced with the philosophical problem created by a new science, can stand to do battle on equal footing with the ruling class ideologicians known as philosophers. The model of this militant, of course, being Lenin, the autodidact. Being Lenin, not Lenin. Lenin, the autodidact, and also all over the place. I like Lenin, but he's all over the place. I can cite chapter and verse for where he contradicts himself. Because he was trying to work it out in real time, actually, that's important to know. This criteria and allow one to establish a heterodox science, but not to replace the criteria that Popper establishes. Popular establishment of criteria doesn't hold up. Experiment. This is why philosophers should be very careful with science, because they do not know how all sciences operate. And I actually have argued with Nico about this for 3 years. Not about Popper, but falsification is problematized profoundly by probability. Because probability implies, unless you have 100% probability, that there's no absolute falsification either. I would suggest Nico read Massimo Pagliucci and then try to reconcile that with Althusser. All right. The criteria to allow one to identify as a heterodox science, but not to replace the criteria that Popper establishes, that the claims of science need to be open to refutation. Okay, that's different from falsifiability. The claims of scientists need to be open to refutation is absolutely true. Falsifiability is more than that, though. If the critiques of science could be claimed to refutation and just say the most probably falsified answer is the most probable thing we should accept until other evidence comes to the contrary. But that's not really what Popper states. Now, honestly, Althusser is closer to it. So Nico actually can defend Althusser on these grounds. Give me advice here, buddy. All right, but for the practitioner of any given heterodox science, this is a simple matter. That is the utterance, articulation, and not any standard which would dissuade them in advance. That is, all it would take to return Marxism to a science by the standards of falsifiability. No, falsifiability is more absolute than that, and no, you couldn't do that. Would be for Marxism to make falsifiable statements. Well, let's actually make this more philosophically coherent. It would be for Marxism to make statements that could be probably rejected by the most probable result of inquiry in empirical fields or by logical inclination. And those are two different things. So I'm going to steelman Nico's use of Popper. Sorry, Nico. Before I studied Marxism, I actually studied philosophy of science. So we can go toe-to-toe on this if you want to, but I think the probability arguments are like why Popper is so problematic and why, even though he's popular like New Atheist in the aughts 20 years ago, he actually isn't that popular even in relatively rigorous philosophies of science. Again, seeing Massimo Pagliucci's discussion of these topics when he was trying to figure out how one sets up what a pseudoscience really is. All right, Hamilton doesn't recognize the status of Althusser's philosopher of heterodox science in part, wittingly or not, because he's playing the part of a partisan of a non-factional orthodoxy. The orthodoxy does not permit any dissent. Whether it's the French Communist Party and Althusser come into conflict, except on the issue of humanism, Hamilton always appears to take the side of the French Communist Party. Well, there's probably obvious reasons for that. Rather than the assessment of Althusser's theory, as I mentioned earlier, on the issue of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which Hamilton critiques Althusser's support for it on the basis it was leading to destabilizing factionalism, aka he's repeating a Dungist line. This position, which is only really tenable from the perspective of upholding the ban on factions within the party, a ban which itself produced a destabilizing sectarianism that almost led to civil war in China. In fact, the Cultural Revolution, I think, forestalled that civil war, to be quite honest. And I'm not the only person who thinks that, but it makes everyone uncomfortable. It is one thing to do an honest reappraisal of the actually existing communist states and comparing their accomplishments with their various crimes, which I think we should do, by the way. It's another thing to support the very foundation of their tyrannical excesses, the faction ban and the censorship and persecution that it led to. Althusser, who never called for the abolition of the faction ban despite his many criticisms of the party, at least had the alibi that he might be expelled if he did, although his later writings do make it clear that he wasn't really in support of it. In this context, Hamilton's reading of Althusser towards the end of his essay is somewhat troubling. Specifically, his attempt to incorporate Althusser's theory of science into a theory of rupture with the logic of the commodity. Here he borrows an analysis from Alfred von Riefenstahl, Frankfurt School, who criticized Althusser for supposedly failing to take the concept of real abstraction literally enough regarding commodity fetishism for making the concept too metaphorical. Some Riefenstahl rejects Althusser's notion that the abstraction of the commodity fetishism appears in thought, instead arguing that it occurs in a spatio-temporal sense, and from here he asserts quantification as something inherently connected to the commodity form. Think about this in terms of Adorno's identity thinking. Hamilton points to that which cannot be captured within this quantifying logic of a commodity as points of resistance to capital. Hence, such a social reproduction that occurs outside the capitalist firm or the environment. He claims that unlike quantitative bourgeois science, proletarian science goes beyond the mathematical and mechanical world, which originates in the logic of community, which I think reeks of vitalism. But that's just me, and that doesn't have anything to do with even Maoism, really. For one, I don't think it's true that Althusser saw real abstraction as a metaphor. As a materialist structuralist, he was likely saw this as a question of materiality of thought, that thought has material basis and material consequences. I'm just clarifying what Nico means by this, because I know what he means by this, and I think he's right. Secondly, this distinction between quantitative bourgeois science and a more qualitative or intimate way of knowing is certainly not something that follows from some Riefenstahl's work. After examining the example of Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union, states that, quote, what emerges from these examples is first, that science indispensable for socialism is methodologically the same as science and capitalism, cough, cough, and second, that socialism has the means to contradict the properties which, in capitalism, constitute the bourgeois character of the science. And notes how, in the case of protecting the environment and socialism, the only accomplished by the unity of all scientific knowledge and the deprofessionalization and thus declassing of scientific knowledge used in production. AKA, we have to reintegrate the scientist and the craftsman. Techne and episteme, excuse me, I keep on mispronouncing that word, have to become the same thing. It's notable when Hamilton corrected McManus on the role of humanism played in Althusser's thought because he omitted a crucial detail. It wasn't just the case that Althusser was opposed to humanism on a strategic ground. He was opposed to its use within science as a way of grounding reality in sensuousness. This is one of the things he criticizes early Marx for, who grounds the realism of the concepts of the German ideology in the terms of their sensuousness. It kind of has an emanationist Hegelian materialism going on there. This is also one of the things that connects empiricism to humanism, a shared epistemology ultimately grounded in something being real because it feels real or otherwise more concrete. Yeah, which actually, I don't know how you get things like, I can talk to you about science as like the unity of as a dialectical unity of the opposition between empiricism and rationalism, and the scientific method is a way of getting around both, almost dialectically. And I know that Nico would consider that both vulgar and far too Hegelian, probably. The modern day era of this sort of epistemology is standpoint epistemology, and there's even a somewhat direct connection through Lukács and intersectional feminism for what it's worth. I've talked to Nico about this. I've made this point for years. I think Nico may actually be summarizing me, but even if he's not, he's making a good point. This is also the remainder we have left with if we remove all quantification or scientific theorization from our epistemology. In contrast, Marxism, or historical materialism, a subset of Marxism, it's a non-political project that inflects a political project. Sorry, I get really technical on this stuff because I don't want people being open to like really simplistic mistakes. And I don't think Nico is making that mistake, but I think you can critique him from the way he's articulating it here. Marxism as a scientific project, which I would not have as a I would have Marxism as a scientific project as not a clause, but as one thing together, would not shrink from the responsibility of actually quantifying social reproduction or the environment, as this would be necessary for creating a rational method of production, specifically a system which would not destroy these other domains through its ignorant operation. Read therefore what troubles me when Hamilton discusses why Leninist thinking of rupture and the politics as in science is needed is not necessarily a means of a political rupture, the dictatorship of the proletariat, etc., for all the dangers involved, would at least be a straightforward application of orthodox Marxist doctrines. Rather, what comes to mind is the old utopian idealist demands that reality conform to some ideal that, if never implemented in an actual political program, would likely lead to some irrevocable disaster, but which, in the meantime, is more likely to fizzle out into idiosyncratic sloganeering of some sect. In other words, the very alternatives to scientific socialism that we are quite familiar with by now. I think we're going to break this into two parts because I've been going for 40 minutes and there's still about half the essay left on the Jacobin end of this. So we'll come back and hear about Jacobin's use, specific use of analytic Marxism and Nico's problem with it in part two. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, find more behind the Patreon. You can find my Patreon by looking in the show notes. You can find the free podcast, which involves the interviews. Anywhere you find podcasts are disaggregated, and protect your peace. We'll come back soon.